it is essentially the topic that never really ends in college sports, and that is conference realignment. I've been following college sports for probably 30 years at this point, and it is an ever-evolving, ever-present topic in college sports. But it really has, over the past 2 off seasons, really picked up steam. Specifically, when Texas and Oklahoma left for the SEC, that led to one wild round of rumors and innuendo and this and that. And then, of course, it was heightened even more last offseason when we found out that UCLA and USC were headed to the Big Ten. And so what I have said over the past couple years is that it is now basically a land grab where everybody that is not in one of those 2 conferences is doing everything they can to get into one of those 2 conferences, or at the very least, find stable footing. We've discussed it a number of times, but what I would also say is it has never been put on paper, I don't believe, as well as it has until Monday, when Ross Dellinger from Sports Illustrated, who actually was on this podcast one time, Ross Dellinger put out a very extensive report for Sports Illustrated explaining the landscape of college sports. And let me tell you, it just isn't pretty. So I want to hit on everything that came out of that article. And what I want to start with is probably the most interesting part of that article, which is the present and future of the ACC. We actually talked about this a few months back. I remember an episode in February. It stemmed from a conversation that kind of leaked out. It was sort of public, but it sort of wasn't, where Florida State's school president, a guy by the name of Michael Alford, basically said, listen, this is not sustainable for us in this league. And so behind the scenes, you kind of knew stuff wasn't going well. But then we found out via the Ross Dellinger report that there are now 7 schools that have been meeting privately that are basically trying to figure out what are our options outside of this conference, or at the very least outside of the TV contract. Those 7 schools, by the way, on Monday afternoon by Brett McMurphy were reported. This was not in the Ross Dellinger report. In the Brett McMurphy report, it was the 7 schools are Florida State, Clemson, Miami, North Carolina, NC State, Virginia Tech, and Virginia. Those are the 7 schools that are kind of trying to see, hey, what's going on? What could we potentially get out of this current situation? So really, the situation with the ACC, those 7 schools are trying to get out. And what it really stems from is basically pretty straightforward and something we've talked about before. They got themselves a really bad TV deal. So the ACC TV deal is bad in 2 ways. One, doesn't pay them very much. Pays them $30 million a year. By the end, it'll be up to about 40, 41, 42 million. There's just one problem. 30 to 35 million a year per school sounds great to a lot of places, but compared to the schools they're competing with in the SEC and the Big Ten, that's about $30 million a year less than what Georgia and Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State and whoever are making. And by the way, it's not just 1 year, it's every year. So every year, say if you're Clemson, South Carolina is making 30 million more than you in 2023, and then 30 more in 2024, and then 30 more in 2025. And so the Clemsons and Florida States, the big football powers, are starting to get worried. Beyond that, this is where it gets really tough, is that the ACC contract is set to run through 2036. So keep that in mind, because again, you're falling behind 30 to 40 million a year now. But the Big Ten is going to renegotiate its TV contract in 7 years. The Big 12 is going to renegotiate its TV contract before the ACC comes up again. So you can imagine how far they're going to fall behind by 2036. When I tell you this is the worst deal since the Louisiana Purchase, I'm pretty sure the ACC TV contract is the worst deal since the Louisiana Purchase. So I bring all this up to say the ACC, the top 7 schools, the 7 schools that I would argue are probably most committed to football, they're frustrated. They're trying to figure out what's next. And really, not just from this article, but in the bigger picture, there's really 2 avenues that those 7 schools are looking to explore in terms of either making more money or getting out of the contract. The way that these 7 schools are trying to figure things out, one of 2 options. They're either going to try to get out of the league, or they are going to try to get an uneven pay scale in the league. In other words, Florida State will make more than Boston College. Clemson will make more than Pitt, etc. Here's the problem. I don't think either one of them is a very good option. In terms of just trying to flat get out of the contract, good luck. And here's why. It's because if you remember, and you might not, you probably don't, but from literally the day that Texas and Oklahoma left announced they were leaving the Big 12 for the SEC, I said it and I'm positive of it. There are schools in this ACC, there are schools in other parts of the country. They're trying to get out of their TV contract. So it's not just a last 2 or 3 weeks thing that Florida State and Clemson and Miami and NC State and UNC have been trying to get out of this contract with the ACC. I believe we're closing in on close to 2 years now that they're trying to figure out a way to get out of it. The contract is called a grant of rights. And what the contract that the grant of rights is basically, let me rephrase. I'm tripping over my words here. The grant of rights, what it basically says is this. All these 15 schools in the ACC have basically agreed to this grant of rights. I think it's 14 because Notre Dame's a basketball or it's a non-football school. But the 14 schools in the ACC, what the grant of rights basically says is this. The ACC owns the rights to broadcast their home sporting events, football specifically in this case. And so why it seems like it's going to be pretty tough to get out of this is, one, their lawyers have been trying for years, and two, even if they were able to pay a fee or get out or do whatever, the ACC would still, in theory, own their TV rights. And so Clemson can leave tomorrow. Florida State can leave tomorrow. But it's uncertain if they would be able to broadcast their TV games, their games on TV, their home games anyway. And so because of it, hate to say it, don't think Florida State has much value to the SEC. Don't think UNC has much value to the SEC or the Big Ten if you can't broadcast their home football games, their home basketball games, or whatever. So because of it, I don't think they're getting out of the grant of rights, at least not anytime soon. Now, at some point, could they pay some exorbitant fee to get out? I think it's possible. But listen, Texas and Oklahoma paid $50 million to get out of their grant of rights with the Big 12 a year ahead of schedule. And the Big 12 agreed to it and was ready to move on. We're talking about 13 more years of this grant of rights. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. Because of it, I don't see the scenario where they have much success getting out of this contract. Although, again, the lawyers are going to try, but it leads to a second situation with the grant of rights or with the ACC. And that second situation is this. From there, they are going to try to push for an uneven distribution model. And this is something that we have talked about before. But in February, there was a big report. The commissioner, the president of Florida State, he basically went on record and said, look, this is not sustainable. And we don't think, frankly, it's even fair to us. It's not fair to us because we make way more revenue for this conference than most everybody else. The number that he pegged based on TV ratings, based on the number of games that got this many viewers, I believe the number was like 7 million or 5 million or something viewers. Florida State's AD basically said, look, we make 15% of the revenue for this entire conference, yet we're getting paid the same amount as Boston College and Pitt and Syracuse. That has to change. And so on the one hand, that feels more feasible to me than just breaking the contract. I don't think that's really in the cards. The problem becomes, and we talked about this a few months ago, why would Pitt or Boston College or Wake Forest or Syracuse agree to an uneven distribution model? Even if Clemson and Florida State are making a disproportional amount of money for the conference, why would Boston College or Syracuse agree? Because at the end of the day, one, it doesn't really help them. Boston College and Wake Forest can look North Carolina and Clemson and whoever in the eye and say, you agreed to this deal. You already have the advantage of the bigger fan base, the bigger alumni base, the more aggressive boosters. Now we're going to give you more money on top of that? Sorry, you agreed to this deal. We were all in this together when we signed it. So that's one. And then two, think about it from like Boston College's perspective or Syracuse's perspective. Besides the fact that it's just giving away more money, it also doesn't guarantee that Clemson or Florida State is going to stay beyond 2036. So if I'm Boston College or I'm Syracuse or I'm whatever, I just say, sorry, we're riding this thing out as long as we can. Because even if we agree to give you more money, all you're gonna do is take our money and then go to the SEC the second that you can get out of this deal. So I don't want to keep going on with this ACC thing, but it's going to be a fascinating story to watch unfold over these next couple months, couple years, because clearly these 7 schools are not happy. But I'm also not positive that there's a way out. And so if I had to guess, I think the ACC, I think it's going to be business as usual, because I just don't see the scenario where they can get out. Let's keep it going. And let's get to the tango between the Big 12 and the Pac-12. Okay, so this is like the story that won't die. I know I've used the Undertaker GIF reference a few times, but every time you think this story is dead, it just keeps on coming back and coming back and coming back. And the crux of the story is pretty straightforward, right? It is that the Pac-12 lost USC and UCLA a year ago. The Pac-12, their current TV deal expires in 2024. And so the Pac-12 has basically been for years now trying to close this TV deal. And then obviously the economics changed quite a bit when USC and UCLA left. And so it's this weird song and dance where the Pac-12 schools aren't really ready to commit to each other, but they're not really ready to leave for anywhere else. And everybody's kind of trying to talk about unity while also looking to see what other options are out there. Oregon and Washington publicly flirting with the Big Ten, trying to get the Big Ten to notice them, to use the bad bar reference. Oregon and Washington are the guys at the bar trying to get the cute girl to get them to notice them. And the cute girl's just like, sorry, dude, no, thank you. Meanwhile, those 4 corner schools, Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah, they're sort of flirting with the Big 12. They're sort of saying, hey, we're not ready to go through with this divorce yet, but keep our number and let's see what happens. In other words, take my number, call me in about 2 months. Right now, I'm happy with my marriage situation, but give it another 2-3 months, we might see. And so it's this weird just song and dance where the Pac-12 publicly is saying all the right things. We're in this together. We're working towards a TV deal because, again, this is the important thing with the Pac-12. While the ACC's TV deal ends sometime, aliens are going to have taken over by the time the ACC deal ends. The Pac-12's TV deal ends literally a year from now, and they have nothing in place. The problem for the Pac-12 is basically the problem that they've had all along. 1, they can't get anybody to commit. But 2, the real problem just comes down to finding a distributor for their content, for their games, right? And the problem becomes pretty straightforward. 1, it feels like most of the major networks are just like, no thanks, I'm out. ESPN is financially invested in the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 12. Fox is committed to the Big 10 and the Big 12 and the Mountain West. CBS is committed to the Big 10 and the Mountain West, NBC to the Big 10 and Notre Dame. So everybody's money's already spread thin. And so the Pac-12 is trying to work with some alternative, programming. The CW has been mentioned. I think we talked about Ion TV at some point. And then there's also the alternative of streaming. But the problem with streaming is the Pac-12, I believe, and it's not even I believe, I know this for a fact, they're getting pushback from their school presidents and their athletic directors in that we're okay with an idea of some streaming, but we don't want to be exclusively streaming, or we don't want to be the majority of our games on streaming. And it's just basically a simple logistical thing. Just think about it, right? Is that it's one thing if Amazon has one Thursday night football game a week, but imagine if Amazon took like a single game on a Sunday, and you're trying to flip back between CBS and Fox and Red Zone, and now you got to flip on Amazon too. It gets complicated. And so that's where the Pac-12 is getting held up. Even if one of these streaming partners comes in with a lot of money, is it going to be enough money that it makes it worthwhile to put most of their games essentially behind a paywall for people that have a normal cable TV system? And it gets complicated. And that's where I think the Pac-12 is being held up. The major networks are playing hardball, and the streamers are interesting, but does the Pac-12 want to be the first major league, at least in sports, in college sports, to have all of its games on a stream? And so again, it's this weird song and dance. And I'll be honest, well, I think the ACC is kind of stuck and they can't really do anything. I think the Pac-12 is the exact opposite. I think the Pac-12 is in big trouble. Couple reasons why. One, first of all, I don't think they're going to get the TV deal that they want. I know I've talked about it before, but we are now closing in on what? We are closing in on a year since USC and UCLA left. If the TV money was there, they would have gotten it by now. I don't believe that that money is there. Beyond that, I also think, I'm the only one that's saying this and I don't get it. I think that it's worth noting that the Big 12, that ESPN and that Fox both have a contract with the Big 12. I think that's important for the obvious reason of the two biggest players in this space, ESPN and Fox. It incentivizes them to make the Big 12 as strong as it possibly can. How do you incentivize them? You get those corner schools that you want. You get maybe Oregon and Washington to commit. And then you push everybody else to the side. Then you don't have to pay for the Pac-12 and you get the schools that you want in the Big 12. On top of that, it's also worth noting the Big 12 looking to expand west, which would give that extra TV window of that late 10 p.m. game. So I'm going on and on. I need to get to break here, but those are the two big storylines. I don't think the ACC can do anything. I do think the Pac-12 is in trouble. There were two other interesting nuggets from that conference from that article that I want to discuss. One, as I've told you many times, I don't think the SEC and the Big Ten are expanding right now. Okay. And this goes back to, there was a part in the article where they said that the Big Ten did kick the tires on Oregon and Washington, but that essentially the TV people were like, we're not paying for Oregon and Washington. And so I keep hearing this from all these people that are supposed to know what they're talking about. What I keep saying is the only way that the Big Ten or the SEC is going to expand is if new schools can bring more revenue to their TV contracts. And right now, outside of Notre Dame, or maybe some of those ACC schools, Clemson, North Carolina, Florida State, those schools and those brands don't exist. So stop telling me that Oregon and Washington are a done deal. And I saw another report, oh, they've been vetted and they've been this and they've been that. Until you can prove to me that those schools bring more money to a TV deal, I don't buy that they're going to the Big Ten. Now, maybe it gets to the point, and Dellinger's article did say this, is that maybe it does get to a point where maybe, just maybe, the Pac-12 breaks up and they get enough money from the Big Ten where they take a percentage of, they don't get the full share, basically. Then could it happen? Absolutely. But right now, I don't think Oregon and Washington, I don't think the Big Ten wants them. Finally, and I got this question about 4 or 5 times via DM. There was a reference to the Big 12 and UConn having conversations. Now, first of all, I would say this. If you listen to this podcast from beginning to end, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I actually kind of hinted this about 2-3 weeks ago. It was when the Big 12 said they planned on playing games in Mexico. And I talked about all the different initiatives the Big 12 is looking at. And one thing I said was expansion, the 4 corner schools. And I said, oh, by the way, there's whispers that they've been in conversation with UConn. And so I told you 2-3 weeks ago that this could potentially happen. And now it came to light in this Ross Dellinger article. A lot of you have asked what I think about it. And let me just say this. In terms of UConn potentially leaving the Big East again for a conference in the Midwest again, or really the Southwest, I'll just say I'm pretty torn, okay? So what I would say is I'm pretty torn about the idea of UConn leaving for the obvious reasons. On the one hand, I hate it because guess what? About 10 years ago, UConn decided to leave the Big East for another conference based on football. It was called the AAC, and it was a complete disaster. And it almost killed their athletic department. So I hate the idea of UConn leaving the Big East to go to another conference that geographically doesn't make sense to try to help the football program. And I love football. I love UConn football. Love Jim Moore. He's been on this podcast. He's a great guy. But I'm not crazy about it. And I'm not crazy about UConn joining the ACC either. You know why? Because all the good schools are trying to get out of the ACC. And so is there going to be that much more money in the ACC in 10 years if Florida State and Clemson and Miami and all them are gone? The second thing, though, while I don't love the idea of UConn to the Big 12, I'd also say I do sort of get it. Because while I hate the geography and I hate tearing up the Big East again, what I would also say is it's a bottom line, money-driven business. And I don't know for UConn as a whole if they can stay relevant staying in the Big East the way that they want to stay relevant. UConn is pretty much good at every sport other than football, okay? National championship in men's basketball. Women's basketball speaks for itself. Baseball is in the top 20 nationally right now. Men's ice hockey, you go on and on down the list. Well, you know what you need to keep operating at a really high level in every sport? Money, lots of it. And that's where I get tripped up with UConn. I don't know that UConn can maintain its across-the-board success on whatever the Big East TV contract currently is. I was told it's somewhere like $8, $10, $12 million. So think about it. All these ACC schools are saying, we can't get by on 30 whatever million a year. UConn's potentially making like a third of that in the Big East, which obviously is not a football-driven conference. There is no Big East football. And so it becomes a bottom line thing for UConn. Do you risk staying in this conference and being at a financial disadvantage going forward? Because guess what? At some point in the near future, Dan Hurley is going to get a really big raise. And I don't know what that raise is, but my guess is he's going to be due like probably like a $6 million a year head coach. That's kind of the going rate for a national championship caliber head coach. Baseball, Jim Pender's just got a raise. Gino Auriemma is obviously very highly paid. So you got to have a way to pay for all this. And if you don't join the Big 12 or another power conference, then you potentially risk falling behind financially and losing those elite coaches. Obviously, Gino Auriemma is not going anywhere. But I'll just say really quick, I had somebody bring this up to me. What if John Calipari retires after next year? What if John Calipari, like this is just a hypothetical, right? But what if like Kentucky has another really bad year and John Calipari is basically forced into retirement? Kentucky's in the SEC. Kentucky can offer whoever they believe is the best coach available pretty much any money that they want. And let's say Kentucky thinks that Dan Hurley is the best coach available, and that's the guy that they really want. They can offer some staggering amount of money that UConn simply can't match. And so that's why I understand the idea of going to the ACC, or the Big 12, excuse me. I don't love it, but I do think it's something that needs to be considered. It's something I know is being considered, and I'll be curious what the next steps are.